Hello, my friends, it's Indiana Holmes, and we continue with The Three Musketeers, Chapter 40, A Terrible Vision. The cardinal leaned his elbow on his manuscript, his cheek upon his hand, and looked intently at the young man for a moment. No one had a more searching eye than the Cardinal de Richelieu, and D'Artagnan felt his glance run through his veins like a fever. He, however, kept a good countenance, holding his hat in his hand, and awaiting the good pleasure of his Eminence, without too much assurance, but also without too much humility. "Monsieur," said the cardinal, "are you a D'Artagnan from Bern?" "Yes, monsieur," replied the young man. "There are several branches of the D'Artagnans at Tarbes and in its environs," said the cardinal. "To which do you belong?" "I am the son of him who served the religious wars under the great King Henry, and the father of his gracious majesty." "That is well. It is you who set out 7 or 8 months ago from your country to seek your fortune in the capital." "Yes, monsieur." "You came through Meung, where something befell you. I don't very well know what, but still something." "Monseigneur," said the D'Artagnan, "this was what happened." Never mind," resumed the cardinal, with a smile which indicated that he knew the story as well as he who wished to relate it. "You were recommended to Monsieur de Treville, were you not?" "Yes, monseigneur. But in that unfortunate affair at Meung, the letter was lost," replied his Eminence. "Yes, I know that. But Monsieur de Treville is a skilled physiognomist who knows men at first sight, and he placed you in the company of his brother-in-law, Monsieur d'Essart, leaving you to hope that one day or the other you should enter the Musketeers." "Monseigneur is correctly informed," said D'Artagnan. "Since that time many things have happened to you. You were walking one day behind the Château, when it would have been better if you had been elsewhere. Then you took with your friends a journey to the waters of Forges. They stopped on the road, but you continued yours. That is very simple. You had business in England." "Monseigneur," said D'Artagnan, quite confused, "I went hunting at Windsor or elsewhere. That concerns nobody. I know, because it is my office to know everything. On your return you were received by an august personage, and I perceive with pleasure that you preserve the souvenir she gave you." D'Artagnan placed his hand upon the queen's diamond, which he wore, and quickly turned the stone over, but it was too late. "The day after that you received a visit from Cavois," resumed the cardinal. "He went to desire you to come to the place, or I should say the palace. You have not returned that visit, and you were wrong." "Monseigneur, I feared I had incurred disgrace with your Eminence." "How could that be, monsieur? Could you incur my displeasure by having followed the orders of your superiors with more intelligence and courage than another would have done? It is the people who do not obey that I punish, and not those who, like you, obey but too well. As a proof, remember the date of the day on which I had bidden to you to come to me, and seek in your memory for what happened to you that very night." "That was the very evening when the abduction of Madame Bonchaneu took place." D'Artagnan trembled, and he likewise recollected that during the past half hour the poor woman had passed close to him, without doubt carried away by the same power that had caused her disappearance. "In short," continued the cardinal, "as I have heard nothing of you for some time past, I wish to know what you were doing. Besides, you owe me some thanks. You must yourself have remarked how much you have been considered in all circumstances." D'Artagnan bowed with respect. "That," continued the cardinal, "arose not only from a feeling of natural equity, but likewise from a plan I have marked out with respect to you." D'Artagnan became more and more astonished. "I wished to explain this plan to you on the day you received my first invitation, but you did not come. Fortunately, nothing is lost by this delay, and you are now about to hear it. Sit down there before me. D'Artagnan, you are a gentleman enough not to listen standing. and the cardinal pointed with his finger to a chair for the young man, who was so astonished at what it was passing that he awaited a second sign from his interlocutor before he obeyed. You are brave, Monsieur d'Artagnan, continued his Eminence. You are prudent, which is still better. I like men of head and heart. Don't be afraid, said he, smiling. By men of heart, I mean men of courage. But young as you are, and scarcely entering into the world, you have powerful enemies. If you do not take great heed, they will destroy you. Alas, Monseigneur, replied the young man, very easily, no doubt, for they are strong as well as supported, while I am alone. Yes, that's true, but alone as you are, you have done much already, and will do still more, I don't doubt. Yet you need, I believe, to be guided in the adventurous career you have undertaken, for if I mistake not, you came to Paris with the ambitions and the ambitious idea of making your fortune. I am at the age of extravagant hopes, Monseigneur, said D'Artagnan. There are no extravagant hopes but for fools, monsieur, and you are a man of understanding. Now, what would you say to an ensign's commission in my guards, and a company after the campaign? Ah, Monseigneur, you accept it, do you not? Monseigneur, replied D'Artagnan, with an embarrassed air. How? You refuse? Cried the cardinal, with astonishment. I am in his Majesty's guards, Monseigneur, and I have no reason to be dissatisfied. But it appears to me that my guards, mine, are also his Majesty's guards, and whoever serves in a French corps serves the king. Monseigneur, your Eminence has ill understood my words. You want a pretext, do you not? I comprehend. Well, you have this excuse, advancement, the opening campaign, the opportunity which I offer you, so much for the world. As regards yourself, the need of protection, for it is fit you should know, Monsieur d'Artagnan, that I have received heavy and serious complaints against you. You do not consecrate your days and nights wholly to the king's service. D'Artagnan colored. In fact, said the cardinal, placing his hands upon a bundle of papers, I have here a whole pile which concerns you. I know you to be a man of resolution, and your services, well directed, instead of leading you to ill, might be very advantageous to you. Come, reflect, and decide. Your goodness confounds me, monsieur, replied D'Artagnan. I am conscious of a greatness of soul in your Eminence that makes me mean as an earthworm. But since Monseigneur permits me to speak freely, D'Artagnan paused. Yes, speak. Then I will presume to say that all my friends are in the king's Musketeers and Guards, and that by an inconceivable fatality my enemies are in the service of your Eminence. I should therefore be ill-received here, and ill-regarded there, if I accepted what Monseigneur offers me. Do you happen to entertain the haughty idea that I have not yet made you an offer equal to your value? Asked the cardinal, with a smile of disdain. Monseigneur, your Eminence, is 100 times too kind to me, and on the contrary, I think I have not proved myself worthy of your goodness. The siege of La Rochelle is about to be resumed, Monseigneur. I shall serve under the eye of your Eminence, and if I have the good fortune to conduct myself at the siege in a manner as merits your attention, then I shall at least leave behind me some brilliant action to justify the protection with which you honor me. Everything is best in its time, Monseigneur. Hereafter, perhaps, I shall have the right of giving myself. At present, I shall appear to sell myself. That is to say, you refuse to serve me, monsieur? Said the cardinal, with a tone of vexation, through which, however, might be seen a sort of esteem. Remain free, then, and guard your hatreds and your sympathies. Monseigneur, well, said the cardinal, I don't wish you any ill, but you must be aware it is quite trouble enough to defend and recompense our friends. We owe nothing to our enemies, and let me give you a piece of advice. Take care of yourself, Monsieur d'Artagnan, for From the moment I withdraw my hand from behind you, I would not give an obolus for your life. I will try to do so, Monseigneur, replied the Gascon, with a noble confidence. Remember, at a later period and at a certain moment, if any mischief should happen to you, said Richelieu, significantly, that it was I who came to seek you, and that I did all in my power to prevent this misfortune befalling you. I shall entertain whatever may happen, said D'Artagnan, placing his hand upon his breast and bowing, in eternal gratitude toward your Eminence for that which you now do for me. Well, let it be then. As you have said, Monsieur d'Artagnan, we shall see each other again after the campaign. I will have my eye upon you, for I shall be there, replied the cardinal, pointing with his finger to the magnificent suit of armor which he was to wear. And on our return, well, we'll settle our account. Ah, monsieur, cried D'Artagnan, spare me the weight of your displeasure. Remain neutral, monseigneur, if you find that I act as I becomes a gallant man. Young man, said Richelieu, if I shall be able to say to you at another time what I have said to you today, I promise you to do so. This last expression of Richelieu's conveyed a terrible doubt. It alarmed D'Artagnan more than a menace would have done, for it was a warning. The cardinal then was seeking to preserve him from some misfortune which threatened him. He opened his mouth to reply, but with a haughty gesture the cardinal dismissed him. D'Artagnan went out, but at the door his heart almost failed him, and he felt inclined to return. Then the noble and severe countenance of Athos crossed his mind. If he made the compact with the cardinal, which he required, Athos would no more give him his hand. Athos would renounce him. It was this fear that restrained him. So powerful is the influence of a truly great character on all that surrounds it. D'Artagnan descended by the staircase at which he had entered, and found Athos and 4 Musketeers waiting his appearance. And beginning to grow uneasy, with a word D'Artagnan reassured them, and Planchet ran to inform the other sentinels that it was useless to keep guard longer, as his master had come out safe from the Palais de Cardinal. Returned home with Athos, Aramis, and Porthos, inquired eagerly the cause of the strange interview. But D'Artagnan confined himself to telling them that Monsieur de Richelieu had sent him for the purpose to propose to him to enter into the guards with the rank of ensign, and that he refused. "And you were right," cried Aramis and Porthos with one voice. Athos fell into a profound reverie and answered nothing. But when they were alone, he said, "You have done that which you ought to have done, D'Artagnan, but perhaps you have been wrong." D'Artagnan sighed deeply, for his voice responded to a secret voice of his soul, which told him that great misfortunes awaited him. The whole of the next day was spent in preparations for the departure. D'Artagnan went to take leave of Monsieur de Tréville. At that time it was believed that the separation of the Musketeers and the Guards would be but momentary, the king holding his parliament that very day and proposing to set out that day after Monsieur de Tréville contented himself with asking D'Artagnan if he could do anything for him. But D'Artagnan answered that he was supplied with all he wanted. That night brought together all those comrades of the guards of Monsieur de Essart and the company of the Musketeers of Monsieur de Tréville, who had been accustomed to associate together. They were parting to meet again when it pleased God, and if it pleased God, that night then was somewhat riotous, as may be imagined. In such cases, extreme preoccupation is only to be combated by extreme carelessness. At the first sound of the morning, the friends separated. The Musketeers hastened to the hotel of Monsieur de Tréville, the guards to that of Monsieur de Essart. Each of the captains then led his company to the Louvre, where the king held his review. The king was dull and appeared ill, which distracted a little from his usual lofty bearing. In fact, the evening before, a fever had seized him in the midst of Parliament, while he was holding his bed of justice. He had not the less decided upon setting out the same evening, and in spite of the reminiscences that had been offered him, he persisted in having the review, hoping by setting it in defiance of that to conquer the disease which began to lay hold upon him. The review over, the guards set forth alone their march, the musketeers waiting for the king, which allowed Porthos time to go to take turn in his superb equipment in the Rue aux Ours. The procurator's wife saw him pass in his new uniform and on his fine horse. She loved Porthos too dearly to allow him to part thus. She made him a sign to dismount and come to her. Porthos was magnificent. His spurs jingled, his cuirass glittered, his sword knocked proudly against his ample limbs. This time the clerks evinced no inclination to laugh. Such a real ear-clipper did Porthos appear. The musketeer was introduced to Monsieur Coquenard, whose little gray eyes sparkled with anger at seeing his cousin all blazing anew. Nevertheless, one thing afforded him inward consolation. It was expected by everybody that the campaign would be a severe one. He whispered a hope to himself that this beloved relative might be killed in the field of battle. Porthos paid his compliments to Monsieur Coquenard and bade him farewell. Monsieur Coquenard wished him all sorts of prosperities. As to Madame Coquenard, she could not restrain her tears, but no evil impressions were taken from her grief, as she was known to be very much attached to her relatives, about whom she was constantly having serious disputes with her husband. But the real adieux were made in Madame Coquenard's chamber. They were heart-rending. As long as the procurator's wife could follow him with her eyes, she waved her handkerchief to him, leaning so far out the window as to lead people to believe she wished to precipitate herself. Porthos received all those attentions like a man accustomed to such demonstrations. Only on turning the corner of the street, he lifted his hat gracefully and waved it to her as a sign of adieu. On his part, Aramis wrote a long letter, to whom nobody knew. Kitty, who was to be set free out that evening for Tours, was waiting in the next chamber. Athos sipped the last bottle of his Spanish wine. In the meantime, D'Artagnan was defiling with his company. Arriving at Faubourg Saint-Antoine, he turned around to look gaily at the Bastille. But as it was the Bastille alone he looked at, he did not observe Milady, who, mounted upon a light chestnut horse, designated him with her finger to two ill-looking men who came close up to the ranks to take notice of him. To a look of interrogation which they made, Milady replied a sign that it was he. Then, certain that there would be no mistake in the execution of her orders, she started her horse and disappeared. The two men followed the company, and on leaving the Faubourg de Saint-Antoine, mounted two horses properly equipped, which a servant without livery had waiting for them. Chapter 41. The Siege of La Rochelle. The Siege of La Rochelle was one of the great political events of the reign of King Louis XIII, and one of the great military enterprises of the cardinal. It is, then, interesting and even necessary that we should say a few words about it, particularly as many details of this siege are connected in too important a manner with the story we have undertaken to relate to allow us to pass over in silence. The political plans of the cardinal when he undertook the siege were extensive. let us unfold them first, and then pass on to the private plans, which perhaps had not less influence upon His Eminence than the others. Of the important cities given by Henry IV to the Huguenots as places of safety, there only remained La Rochelle. It became necessary, therefore, to destroy this last bulwark of Calvinism, a dangerous leaven with which the ferments of civil revolt and foreign war were constantly mingling. Spaniards, Englishmen, and Italian malcontents, adventurers of all nations, and soldiers of fortune of every sect flocked at the first summons under the standard of the Protestants, and organized themselves like a vast association whose branches diverged freely over parts of Europe. La Rochelle, which had derived a new importance from the ruin of other Calvinist cities, was then the focus of the dissensions and ambition. Moreover, its port was the last of the kingdom of France open to the English, and by closing it against England, our eternal enemy, the cardinal, completed the work of Joan of Arc and the Duc de Guise. Thus, Bassompierre, whom was at once Protestant and Catholic, Protestant by conviction and Catholic as commander of the Order of the Holy Ghost of Bassompierre, who was a German by birth and a Frenchman at heart. In short, Bassompierre, who had a distinguished command at the siege of La Rochelle, said, in charging at the head of several other Protestant nobles like himself, "You will see, gentlemen, that we shall be fools enough to take La Rochelle." And Bassompierre was right. The cannonade of the Isle of Ré presaged to him the dragonnades of the Cevennes. And the taking of La Rochelle was the preface to the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. We have hinted that by the side of these views of the leveling and simplifying minister, which belong to history, the chronicler is forced to recognize the lesser motives of the amorous man and jealous rival. Richelieu, as everyone knows, had loved the queen. Was this love a simple political affair, or was it naturally one of those profound passions which Anne of Austria inspired in those who approached her? That we are not able to say, but at all events we have seen by the anterior developments of this story that Buckingham had the advantage over him. And in 2 or 3 circumstances, particularly that of the diamond studs, had, thanks to the devotedness of the 3 Musketeers and the courage and conduct of D'Artagnan, cruelly mystified him. It was then Richelieu's object not only to get rid of an enemy of France, but to avenge himself on arrival. But this vengeance must be grand and striking, and worthy in every way of a man who held his hand as his weapon for combat, the forces of a kingdom. Richelieu knew that in combating England, he combated Buckingham, that in triumphing over England, he triumphed over Buckingham. In short, that in humiliating England in the eyes of Europe, he humiliated Buckingham in the eyes of the Queen. On his side, Buckingham, in pretending to maintain the honor of England, was moved by interest exactly like those of the cardinal. Buckingham also was pursuing a private vengeance. Buckingham could not, under any pretense, be admitted into France as an ambassador. He wished to enter as its conqueror. It resulted from this that the real stake in this game, which 2 most powerful kingdoms played for the good pleasure of 2 amorous men, was simply a kind of look from Anne of Austria. The first advantage had been gained by Buckingham, arriving unexpectedly in sight of the Isle of Ré with 90 vessels and nearly 20,000 men. he had surprised the Comte de Toyas, who commanded for the king in the Isle, and he had, after a bloody conflict, effected his landing. Allow us to observe in passing that in his fight perished the Baron de Chantal, that the Baron de Chantal left a little orphan girl, 18 months old, and that this little girl was afterwards Madame de Savigny. The Comte de Toyas retired into the citadel of Saint-Martin with his garrison and threw 100 men into a little fort called the Fort La Prée. This event had hastened the resolutions of the cardinal, and till the king and he could take command of the siege of La Rochelle, was determined he had sent Monseigneur to direct the first operations, and had ordered all troops he could dispose of to march toward the theater of war. It was this detachment, sent as a vanguard, that our friend D'Artagnan formed a part. The king, as we have said, was to follow as soon as his bed of justice had been held. But on rising from his bed of justice on the 28th of June, he felt himself attacked by fever. He was, notwithstanding, anxious to set out, but his illness becoming more serious, he was forced to stop at Villeroy. Now, whenever the king halted, the Musketeers halted. It followed that D'Artagnan, who was yet purely and simply in the Guards, found himself for a time at least separated from his good friends Athos, Porthos, and Aramis. This separation, which was no more than an unpleasant circumstance, would have certainly become a cause of serious uneasiness if he had been able to guess by what unknown dangers he was surrounded. He, however, arrived without accident in the camp established before La Rochelle on the 10th of the month of September in the year of 1627. Everything was in the same state. The Duke of Buckingham and his English masters of the Isle of Ré continued to besiege, but without success, the citadel of Saint-Martin and the fort of La Prée, and hostilities with La Rochelle had commenced 2 or 3 days before, about a fort which the Duc d'Angoulême had caused to be constructed near the city. The guards, under the command of M. d'Assart, took up their quarters at the Mimiers. But, as we know, D'Artagnan, possessed with ambition to enter the Musketeers, had formed but a few friendships among his comrades, and he felt himself isolated and given up to his own reflections. His reflections were not very cheerful. From the time of his arrival in Paris, he had been mixed up with public affairs, but his own private affairs had made no great progress, either in love or fortune. As to love, the only woman he could have loved was Madame Bonchenue, and Madame Bonchenue had disappeared, without his being able to discover what had become of her. As to fortune, he had made humble as he was, an enemy of the cardinal. That is to say, a man before whom trembled the greatest men of the kingdom, beginning with the king. That man had the power to crush him, and yet he had not done so. For a mind so perspicuous as that of D'Artagnan, this indulgence was a light by which he caught a glimpse of better future. Then he had made himself another enemy, less to be feared, he thought, but nevertheless he instinctively felt not to be despised. This enemy was Milady. In exchange for all this, he had acquired the protection and goodwill of the queen, but the favor of the queen was at present time an additional cause for persecution, and her protection, as it was known, protected badly, as witness Chalais and Madame Bonchenue. What he had clearly gained in all this was the diamond, worth 5,000 or 6,000 livres, which he wore on his finger, and even this diamond supposing that D'Artagnan, in his projects of ambition, wished to keep it, to make it some day a pledge for the gratitude of the queen, had not in the meantime, since he could not part with it, more value than the gravel he trod under his feet. We say the gravel he trod under his feet, for D'Artagnan made these reflections while walking solitarily along a pretty little road which led from the camp to the village of Anguitine. Now these reflections had led him further than he intended, and the day was beginning to decline when, by the last ray of the setting sun, he thought he saw the barrel of a musket glittering from behind a hedge. D'Artagnan had a quick eye and a prompt understanding. He comprehended that the musket had not come there by itself, and that he who bore it had not concealed himself behind a hedge with any friendly intentions. He determined therefore to direct his course as clear from it as he could, when, on the opposite side of the road, from behind a rock, he perceived the extremity of another musket. This was evidently an ambush, or as they used to call it in France, an ambuscade. The young man cast a glance at the first musket and saw, with a certain degree of inquietude, that it was leveled in his direction. But as soon as he perceived that the orifice of the barrel was motionless, he threw himself upon the ground, as at the same instant the gun was fired, and he heard the whistling of the ball pass over his head. No time was to be lost. D'Artagnan sprang up with a bound, and at the same instant the ball from the other musket tore up the gravel on the side of the very spot on the road where he had thrown himself with the face to the ground. D'Artagnan was not one of those foolhardy men who seek a ridiculous death in order that it be said of them that they did not retreat a single step. Besides, courage was out of the question here. D'Artagnan had fallen into an ambush. "If there is a third slot, or a third shot," said he to himself, "I am a lost man." He immediately, therefore, took to his heels and ran toward the camp with the swiftness of a young man of his country, so renowned for their agility. But whatever might be his speed, the first who fired, having had time to reload, fired a second shot, and this time so well aimed that it struck his hat and carried it 10 paces from him. He, however, had no other hat. He picked up this as he ran, and arrived at his quarters very pale and quite out of breath. He sat down without saying a word to anybody and began to reflect. This event may have 3 causes. The first, and the most natural, was that it might be an ambush of the Rochellais, who might be not sorry to kill one of his Majesty's guards, because it would be an enemy the less, and this enemy might have well furnished purse in his pocket. D'Artagnan took his hat, examined the hole made by the ball, and shook his head. The ball was not a musket ball. It was an aqueous ball. The accuracy of the aim had first given him the idea that a special weapon had been employed. This was not, then, a military ambuscade, as the ball was not of the regular caliber. This might be a kind of remembrance of Monseigneur the Cardinal. It may be observed that at the very moment when, thanks to the ray of the sun, he perceived the gun barrel, he was thinking with astonishment on the forbearance of his Eminence with respect to him. But D'Artagnan again shook his head. For people toward him, he had but to put forth his hand. His Eminence had rarely recourse to such means. It might be vengeful, and a vengeance of Milady. That was most probable. He tried in vain to remember the faces or dress of the assassins. He had escaped so rapidly that he had no leisure, in fact, to notice anything. "Ah, my poor friends," murmured D'Artagnan, "where are you? And that you should fail me. D'Artagnan passed a very bad night. 3 or 4 times he started up, imagining that a man was approaching his bed for the purpose of stabbing him. Nevertheless, day dawned without darkness having brought any accident to him. But D'Artagnan well suspected that which was deferred was not relinquished. D'Artagnan remained all day in his quarters, assigning as reason to himself that the weather was bad. At 9 o'clock the next morning the drums beat to arms, and the Duc d'Orléans visited the posts. The guards were under arms, and D'Artagnan took his place in the midst of his comrades. Monseigneur passed along the front lines. Then all the superior officers approached him to pay their compliments. Monsieur d'Essart, captain of the guards, as well as the others. At the expiration of a minute or two, it appeared to D'Artagnan that Monsieur d'Essart made him a sign to approach. He waited for a fresh gesture on the part of his superior, for fear he might be mistaken. But this gesture being repeated, he left the ranks and advanced to receive orders. Monseigneur is about to ask for some men of good will for a dangerous mission, but one which will do honor to those who shall accomplish it, and I made you a sign in order that you might hold yourself in readiness. Thanks, my captain, replied D'Artagnan, who wished for nothing better than an opportunity to distinguish himself under the eye of the lieutenant general. In fact, the Rochellese had made a sortie during the night and had retaken a bastion of which the royal army had gained possession 2 days before. The matter was to ascertain by reconnoitering how the enemy guard this bastion. At the end of a few minutes, Monseigneur raised his voice and said, I want for this mission 3 or 4 volunteers, led by a man who can be depended upon. As the man is to be depended upon, I have him under my hand, Monseigneur, said Monsieur d'Essart, pointing to D'Artagnan. And as to the 4 or 5 volunteers, Monseigneur has but to make his intentions known, and the men will not be wanting. 4 men of good will, who will risk being killed with me, said D'Artagnan, raising his sword. 2 of his comrades of the guards immediately sprang forward, and 2 other soldiers having joined them. The number was deemed sufficient. D'Artagnan declined all others, being unwilling to take the first chance from those who had the priority. It was not known whether after taking of the bastion, the Rochellese had evacuated it or left a garrison in it. The object, then, was to examine the place near enough to verify the reports. D'Artagnan set out with his 4 companions and followed the trench. The 2 guards marched abreast with him, and the 2 soldiers followed behind. They arrived thus screened by the lining of the trench, till they came within 100 paces of the bastion. There, on the turning round, D'Artagnan perceived that 2 soldiers had disappeared. He thought that, beginning to be afraid, they had strayed behind, and stayed behind, and he continued to advance. At the turning of the counterscarp, they found themselves within 60 paces of the bastion. They saw no one, and the bastion seemed abandoned. The 3 composing our forlorn hope were deliberating whether they should proceed any further, when all at once a circle of smoke enveloped the giant of stone, and a dozen balls came whistling round D'Artagnan and his companions. They knew all they wished to know. The bastion was guarded, and longer stay in this dangerous spot would have been useless imprudence. D'Artagnan and his 2 companions turned their backs and commenced a retreat which resembled a flight. On arriving at the angle of the trench, which was to serve them as a rampart, one of the guardsmen fell. A ball had passed through his breast. The other, who was safe and sound, continued his way toward the camp. D'Artagnan was not willing to abandon his companion thus, and stooped to raise him and assist him in regaining the lines. But at this moment 2 shots were fired. One ball struck the head of the already wounded man, and the other flattened itself against a rock, after having passed within 2 inches of D'Artagnan. The young man turned quickly round, and, for this attack could not have come more from the bastion, which was hidden by the angle of the trench. The idea of 2 soldiers who had abandoned him occurred to his mind, and with them he remembered the assassins of the 2 evenings before. He resolved this time to know whom he had to deal, and fell upon the body of his comrade as if he were dead. He quickly saw the 2 heads appear above the abandoned work within 30 paces of him. They were the heads of the 2 soldiers. D'Artagnan had not been deceived. These 2 men had only followed for the purpose of assassinating him, hoping that the young man's death would be placed to the account of the enemy. As he might only be wounded and might denounce their crime, they came up to him with the purpose of making sure. Fortunately, deceived by D'Artagnan's trick, they neglected to reload their guns. When they were within 10 paces of him, D'Artagnan, who was falling, had taken care not to let go of his sword, sprang up close to them. The 2 assassins comprehended that if they fled toward the camp without having killed their man, they should be accused by him. Therefore, their first idea was to join the enemy. One of them took his gun by the barrel and used it as he would a club. He aimed a terrible blow at D'Artagnan, who avoided it by springing to one side. But by this movement, he left a passage free to the bandit, who darted off toward the bastion. As the Rochellais who guarded the bastion were ignorant of the intentions of the man they saw coming toward them, they fired upon him, and he fell, struck by a ball which broke his shoulder. Meantime, D'Artagnan had thrown himself upon the other soldier, attacking him with his sword. The conflict was not long. The wretch had nothing to defend himself with but his discharged arquebus. The sword of the guardsman slipped along the barrel, and now useless weapon, and passed through the thigh of the assassin, who fell. D'Artagnan immediately placed the point of his sword at his throat. "Oh, do not kill me," cried the bandit. "Pardon, pardon, my officer, and I will tell you all. In your secret, of enough importance to me to spare your life for it?" asked the young man, withholding his arm. "Yes, if you think existence worth anything to a man of 20, as you are, and who may hope for everything, being handsome and brave as you are." "Wretch," cried D'Artagnan, "speak quickly. Who employed you to assassinate me?" "A woman, whom I don't know, but who is called Milady." "But if you don't know this woman, how do you know her name?" "My comrade knows her, and called her so. It was with him she agreed, and not with me. He even has in his pocket a letter from that person, who attaches great importance to you, as I have heard him say. But how did you become concerned in this villainous affair?" "He proposed to me to undertake it with him, and I agreed." "And how much did she give you for this fine enterprise?" 100 louis. "Well, come," said the young man, laughing. "She thinks I am worth something. 100 louis? Well, that was temptation for 2 wretches like you. I understand why you accepted it, and I grant you my pardon, but upon one condition." "What is that?" said the soldier, uneasy at perceiving that all was not over. "That you will go and fetch me the letter your comrade has in his pocket." "But," cried the bandit, "that is only another way of killing me. How can I go fetch that letter under the fire of the bastion?" "You must nevertheless make up your mind to go and get it, or I swear you shall die by my hand." "Pardon, monsieur, pity, in the name of that young lady you love, and whom you perhaps believe dead, but who's not," cried the bandit, throwing himself upon his knees and leaning upon his hand, for he began to lose his strength with his blood. "And now, how do you know there is a young woman who I am in love with, and that I believed that woman dead?" asked D'Artagnan. "By that letter which my comrade has in his pocket. You see then," said D'Artagnan, "that I must have that letter. So no more delay, no more hesitation, or else, whatever may be my repugnance to soiling my sword a second time with the blood of a wretch like you, I swear by my faith as an honest man." And at these words D'Artagnan made so fierce a gesture that the wounded man sprang up. "Stop, stop!" cried he, regaining strength by force of terror. "I will go, I will go." D'Artagnan took the soldier's arquebus, made him go on before him, and urged him toward his companion by pricking him behind with a sword. It was a frightful thing to see this wretch leaving a long track of blood on the ground he passed over, pale with approaching death, trying to drag himself along without being seen to the body of his accomplice, which lay 20 paces from him. Terror was so strongly painted on his face, covered with cold sweat, that D'Artagnan took pity on him, casting upon him a look of contempt. "Stop," said he. "I will show you the difference between a man of courage and such a coward as you. Stay where you are. I will go myself." And with a light step and an eye on the watch, observing the movements of the enemy and taking advantage of accidents on the ground, D'Artagnan succeeded in reaching the second soldier. There were two means of gaining his object: to search him on the spot, or to carry him away, making a buckler of his body and search him in the trench. D'Artagnan preferred the second means, and lifted the assassin onto his shoulders. At the moment the enemy fired. A slight shock, the dull noise of 3 balls which penetrated the flesh, a last cry, a convulsion of agony, proved to D'Artagnan that the would-be assassin had saved his life. D'Artagnan regained the trench, and threw the corpse beside the wounded man, who was as pale as death. Then he began to search a leather pocketbook, a purse, in which was evidently part of the sum of the bandit had received, with a dice box and dice, completed with the possessions of the dead man. He left the box and the dice where they fell, threw the purse to the wounded man, and eagerly opened the pocketbook. Among some unimportant papers he found the following: the letter, that which he had sought at the risk of his own life. And it read, "Since you have lost sight of that woman, and she is now in safety in the convent, which you should never have allowed her to reach, try at least not to miss the man. If you do, you know that my hand stretches far, and that you shall pay very dearly for the 100 louis you have from me." No signature. Nevertheless, it was plain that the letter came from a lady. He consequently kept it as a piece of evidence, and being in the safety behind the angle of the trench, he began to interrogate the wounded man. He confessed that he had undertaken with his comrade, the same who was killed, to carry off a young woman who was to leave Paris by the Barrière de la Villette. But having stopped to drink at a cabaret, they had missed the carriage by 10 minutes. "But what were you to do with that woman?" asked D'Artagnan, with anguish. "We were to have conveyed her to the Hôtel de Place de Royal," said the wounded man. "Yes," murmured D'Artagnan, "that's the place, Milady's own residence." Then the young man tremblingly comprehended what the terrible thirst for vengeance urged this woman on to destroy him, as well as all who loved him, and how well she must have been acquainted with the affairs of the court, since she had discovered all. There could be no doubt she owed this information to the cardinal. But amid all this perceived, with a feeling of real joy, that the queen must have discovered the prison in which poor Madame Bonchenot was explaining her devotion, and that she had freed her from that prison, and the letter he had received from the young woman, and their passage along the road of Chaillot like an apparition, were now all explained. Then also, as Athos had predicted, it became possible to find Madame Bonchenot, and a convent was not impregnable. This idea completely restored clemency to his heart. He turned toward the wounded man, who had watched with intense anxiety as the various expressions of his countenance, and holding out his arm to him, said, "Come, I will not abandon you thus. Lean upon me, and let us return to camp." Yes, said the man, who could scarcely believe in such magnanimity. But it is not to have me hanged. You have my word, said he. For the second time I give you your life. The wounded man sank upon his knees to again kiss the feet of his preserver, but D'Artagnan, who had no longer a motive for staying so near the enemy, abridged the testimonials of his gratitude. The guardsman, who had returned at the first discharge, announced the death of his four companions. They were therefore much astonished and delighted in the regiment when they saw the young man come back safe and sound. D'Artagnan explained the sword wound of his companion by a sortie which he improvised. He described the death of the other soldier and the perils they had encountered. This recital was for him the occasion of the veritable triumph. The whole army talked of this explanation for a day. The Monseigneur paid him his compliments upon it. Besides this, as very great action bears its recompense with it, the brave exploit of D'Artagnan resulted in the restoration of the tranquillity he had lost. In fact, D'Artagnan believed that he might be tranquil, as one of the two enemies was killed and the other devotedness to his interests. This tranquillity proved one thing, that D'Artagnan did not yet know Milady. And that, my friends, is the end of chapter 41. We will continue with the Musketeers tomorrow night. Thank you all, love to you all, and have a good night.
Please hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the notifications button. Thank you very much.